out there. Anyway. Welcome everyone to a continuation of our walk down the street of Wittenberg, where there is a teacher, Martin Luther, head of the theology department there, who has got some new ideas and is trying hard to propagate them. Luther is with me, and so we look at this 95 Theses, and I ask him, where did he get the idea for these theses? He tells me that he found the idea of having indulgences preached next door in the German area of Saxony that are amounts to selling indulgences. And Luther said, why should they sell indulgences when the Pope, if indeed he has all this power in the indulgence, not give them away? Well, obviously there's reason why he doesn't give them away. He's trying to raise money for the building of St. Peter's in Rome. And he has commissioned a speaker, a Dominican by the name of Johann Tetzel, to go to Germany and to preach the indulgence. The Pope gets half of what's brought in, but as a matter of fact, you can't buy an indulgence. There's a good deal of misunderstanding about that. An indulgence is something spiritual, and no more than I can buy an angel can I buy an indulgence. What you received after you made your donation was a certificate that you had received of the indulgence. And Tetzel was an enthusiast. Actually, that's why he'd been sent there. And so it looked bad that on the same platform where he was preaching how everyone should get an indulgence was the bankers who the Pope had to pay in order to get St. Peter's built. He said, that's a fraud. There's nothing to this. And certainly you don't need to go to get an indulgence in order to obtain salvation, which Tetzel was claiming. Now, happily for Luther, he has a sympathetic civil official to be his, his patron. This is Frederick of Saxony. And Frederick is going to see that Luther doesn't meet harm because he has something to worry about, since the emperor is not going to be very pleased that Luther has started this difference in looking at the doctrine of the church. The indulgence forgives the penalty due on earth, and thus for a lot of Catholics, when you got 7 years indulgence, you were getting 7 years out of purgatory. But that's not really the case. Obviously, Luther is going to be getting rid of purgatory because as far as he is concerned, all of this doesn't mean anything. So of the 95 Theses, about half are concerned with the content of what indeed brings salvation. And for Luther, he tells us later on in one of his table talks that he has discovered the true meaning of religion, and that's in faith. And not just in faith, but in faith that it excludes everything else. And thus he finds the statement found in Paul, and he tells us this is what he discovered, that in the first chapter of Romans, there is a statement that Paul says, the just man lives by faith. And for Luther, that opened up a whole new world of understanding religion, that the just man that is becoming one with God comes from the fact that people have faith, not by indulgences, not by masses, private masses, not by pilgrimages, not by all the, well, things that have become part of religion in the 15th, 16th century, that all this is useless. The one thing that's important is faith. And for him, this was a great burden, had been lifted from his consciousness, because prior to that, he had tried the best he could by a variety of devotions, and now he had discovered that these were meaningless, and thus the major change that he makes in his religion and his view of religion and theology is that there is only one thing essential, and that is faith. So he's quite pleased with himself because, in fact, he was almost an immediate success. Within 2 weeks, the rat tracts and or broadsides that he had written had circulated throughout northern Germany, receiving quite a welcome. And Luther soon became well known throughout Germany and received almost complete affirmation from the peasantry who were already feeling somewhat oppressed. The fact that his message spread so soon meant that one of the people who got a letter from him with his statement was his Archbishop, Hohenzollern, a dynasty that continued all the way down to World War I. And also the Pope got a letter from him, and the Pope, where he criticizes the Pope, saying the Pope, where do you get all this authority to run the church? And so he begins to chip away at papal authority. And the Pope is not happy about that because he likes the idea that he should be the one to govern the church, and this is the way it's been for a long time. And so Luther has to deal with that, and he knows that the Pope is going to get after him. First, the Pope, who is Leo X and a Medici, so he comes from the very powerful Florentine family. This is an aside. The Pope had received a present from the King of Portugal that was an elephant. And the Pope loves to ride his elephant around Rome because he's the only one that has an elephant. And the people in Rome must have been very jealous that the Pope had one and he didn't. During Luther's lifetime, there were 3 popes who were in authority, and none of them obviously were very happy with Luther, and eventually he is excommunicated by the Pope. And he responds to his excommunication by taking it and burning it in the university where he teaches, the courtyard there. He also burned the Code of Canon Law that he had a copy of, and thus began a kind of series of book burnings throughout the life of Luther. This was a dramatic way, of course, of showing what you think of the opinion of the person that you disagree with. Now, the fact that he had been excommunicated by the Pope was added to by the edict of the Emperor Charles V to arrest him and have him put on trial for heresy. Now, the penalty for being a heretic goes all the way back to Justinian's code, to the 6th century. And it was a very harsh code. One of the failures of the medieval church was not a strong effort to change the attitude toward penalties, toward crime, and making the penalties extremely severe. And the penalty for being a heretic was to be burned at the stake. And it was a very public event. It was hard for us to realize how awful it was that the person who was accused of being a heretic and refused to recant, was taken out, mocked, put on a scaffold, and there he was, or she was, burned at the stake. And it was a terrible thing, and yet people found that amusing. I can't imagine that attitude, but that's the way it was. And people were still burned at the stake. We know that people were executed all the way down to the 18th century, when it was finally changed. But we still have the death penalty, which tells us that we haven't gotten rid of it, although today it's more a private affair. Well, Luther's doctrine was basically a doctrine of negation, getting rid of things that he felt were contrary to the true faith. With the true faith was simply to have faith, and thus things like purgatory, things like indulgences that we've already talked about, but all these things must go, and the only thing left standing was the Bible. Now, there were several translations of the Bible into German. Luther was not the first to write or translate the Bible, but later on in his life, he undertakes the task of translating the Bible. The Old Testament took some 12 years to translate from Hebrew into German. On the other hand, the New Testament only took him about 2 years. So, but to his credit, he learned the languages so that he would be able to do the translating. And the Bible that Luther translated was done so well that all the other Bibles in German were pretty well forgotten about because of the excellence of Luther's translation. And that perhaps is his greatest contribution to religion and in Germany and in the world. Well, a battle now began between the clergy who were Lutheran and those who remained Catholic. And as I mentioned earlier, the battle went on for decades. And it was very cruel. Again, instead of trying to reach a compromise, the story was to hold on to your side and to beat down the ideas of your opponent. Now, the indulgences, therefore, were just one step above the iceberg. You see a little bit of it. So with the indulgence, it was part of it. But of the way that you saw the religious area, but it wasn't all of it. It really was an attack on the whole system that the Catholics had followed for many decades, and it's not too surprising that it met a good deal of resistance. Indeed, one of the things that identifies the Reformation is that it was mainly kept to Germany, the Scandinavian countries, and Germans who were living abroad, thus the Germans in Romania, for instance, become Lutheran. And the Teutonic Knights, people who live on the Baltic, become Lutheran. But again, most of Europe, at least at this time, were not altogether enamored. Now, Luther took a big chance because he angered the emperor, who didn't like any new religion or new view of religion perpetrated in his domains. And thus he declared Luther an outlaw, and that made him subject to arrest. Anybody could arrest him, and this would mean pretty sure that he would be charged and would meet a good chance that he would be executed. Throughout his life, he was in danger of being arrested and being put on trial. So it's quite a mark of the man's conviction that he was willing to take that risk in order that his ideas should be kept as ideas that involve a true religion. Now, again, a lot of people were, the spread of Lutheranism was heated by the dissatisfaction of the German people as a whole. Now, Germany at the time, as I said, Luther spread his doctrine mainly by tracts that would be circulated, in which the printers turned out by the thousands. Luther is credited with having written 3,000 different literary works in his lifetime. So this kept the printers busy, and they were kind of happy about the argument. But we have to remember that in the 15th century, in the 16th century, religion is a public affair. It's not a private affair as it is here today in America. We don't go and ask somebody, what's your religion, before we buy a loaf of bread. But we do ask that they, are you, in a sense, what once was considered the way to answer the question, who are you, was to say, I'm a Christian. And that indeed was very often what the Christians were called, just it was that. But over time, the idea that you're a Christian fades, and you become a national attached to one of the nations that you are born into. And so you become French, or you become English or Irish. And religion shifts to the private sphere and away from the public one. And that's really a big difference. And that's why it's hard for us to understand Islam. People who are Muslims don't look upon nationality nearly so important as people in the West do, because we are attached to our nation, and it's up to ourselves to decide what religion we will follow. Well, if you're a Muslim, it goes without saying that it's your faith that comes first. Well, when the Pope received the news about Luther, he delegated his authority to an Augustinian. The Augustinian was a religious order that Luther adhere to, and to see if he could convince Luther to calm down and to try to restore, come back to the church, pointing out that the church had been teaching these things for quite some time. And the papal authority especially was something that lasted for a long, that had been a part of religion for quite some time. Well, Luther met with the head of his religious order in Germany, a man named Johann Eck, and Eck was not the kind of person that was given to compromise, and thus the meeting broke up with Luther. And there were a number of times where Catholics and Lutherans got together to see if they could work out some kind of compromise. But interestingly enough, what we would expect was really not discussed. The best example of that is what's known as the Diet of Worms. The Diet of Worms was called by the emperor to meet in Worms, and there to discuss the issue of Luther and Lutheranism. It's now 4 years after the nailing of the Thesis. The emperor sent as his prosecutor, again, Johann Eck. Not too surprisingly, Eck had been the Catholic representative all along. And what happens is the people who ran the affair piled Luther's writings on the table and said, are these things you have written? And the second question was, do you renounce what has been written here? And Luther's statement was, well, can't everything I've written be wrong? Are you going to do something to condemn everything of my writings? And he said, he makes the famous statement that people remember, especially Lutherans, here I stand, here ich stehe, I can do no other unless convinced by Scripture or by right reason or right consciousness. I cannot retract what I have written. So the discussion boiled down to, did he write these books? And obviously the answer was yes. Will he renounce them? No. So after the Council of Worms, even the night that it ended, his friends were afraid that he was going to be arrested. And so he was kidnapped. It was a fake kidnapping, because he wasn't kidnapped by enemies, but by friends who wanted him to get out of the way, lest he be arrested and be put out of commission. So he spent about 9 months in seclusion, which kind of drove him mad, because he was the kind of person that wanted action all the time. So he kept in touch with his followers by letters. He spent all day writing and answering letters that people wrote to him. And he grew a beard, and he didn't cut his hair, so he had a pretty effective disguise. He lived in the castle of his duke, and the castle was pretty remote, and so for 8 months. So he did occupy himself with writing, and he also began his translation of the Bible while in the castle, hiding away, the Warburg Castle. Lutheranism continued to grow because it had the support of the rulers. If it didn't have the ruler's success or blessing, it never succeeded. I'm convinced if the question is, what spawned the Reformation, the answer is the nobility's desire to solidify their power and their authority, and especially the money that came to them in the form of taxes. And a good example of how religion can influence political life occurred 4 years after the nailing of the Theses, when the peasants decided, well, if they're free of the Catholic Church's requirements of the tithe, because in those days 1/10 of your income was supposed to go to the church, if that is abrogated by the circumstances that have now been put forward, then they all should be free of paying any taxes to the Lord. And so what began as a small protest to the taxes that they paid to their Lord, they opened up actual warfare. And this is known as the Peasants' Revolt, because they said, well, if we get rid of the church tax, let's get rid of the nobles' tax too. And it was a very bloody affair. As you could well imagine, the nobility and the kings had the guns, and they had the armor, and they had the fortifications, and they especially had horses. And that gave them a great advantage over peasants who were fighting with pikes, the kind of spear that they had carried. So it was pretty much a massacre. And Luther wrote a pamphlet condemning the peasants. He called them thieving, evil people. And so Luther had to choose between the nobility and the peasantry, and he chose the nobility. And thus, Luther, who had once been a hero to all Germans, now becomes a hero only to some Germans. The Peasants' Revolt had soured a lot of people on what he had in mind. Well, he would have said that's too bad. And so the Diet of Worms fails to do much of anything because Luther didn't stay, and the emperor, despite all his efforts, had to deal with the Duke, who was Luther's protector, and thus, for Luther's point of view, someone who was extremely important. Throughout the Reformation period, and by the way, the word Reformation was not used by anybody until quite late. It was used for changing the curriculum in the schools. That was a reform. The California Board of Education could be reformed, but the idea of reform was not used for the religious event. Another word that has come to be used is Protestant. Nobody used the word Protestant until 1529. The Lutheran princes asked that the laws against heresy not be enforced. And so they protested to the emperor that they be allowed to practice their faith as the faith of believers. Now, as far as adding anything to the church, to religion, I should say that there was not much of a change in the Catholic faith. The Catholic Church does not teach that we save ourselves. as some people were saying who were in the Catholic Church, that we have to have both faith and works, but that the works are equally important as faith. And of course, this would be contrary to what Luther had in mind. He wanted to get rid of everything that wasn't in the Bible. If it's not in the Bible, then out it goes. And thus the devotional life of Catholics that had been a part of the religion for centuries was rejected. And thus the bare bones were preserved in what should be taught. Luther wrote 2 catechisms that are still used, his large catechism and his small catechism. Most Germans at the time could not read, so some of the people had to be taught. But again, let me go back to an example of how religion was public. There was, in one town in Germany, the Catholics and Lutherans went at each other in a debate that lasted for 3 weeks in the city hall. Now, could you imagine getting people that interested that they would be willing to follow their religious teachers and try to decide which one was right and which one was wrong? Again, it's hard to imagine how there would be too many changes, because the Bible remained for Luther just the bedrock. Again, Lutheranism did not do much for art except in music. The thing that the Lutherans sponsored, and which we can appreciate, is the musical renditions that were written. I think Bach, for instance, I suppose is their best example of Lutheran, music. But the music contained theology, and Luther himself was a hymn writer. And again, I think everybody recognizes Ein Fester, God is a mighty fortress. And indeed, in some ways, that is what Luther thought of God, that God is the fortress, God is the protector, God is all-powerful. And the only hope that you have of salvation is to unite yourself to God and to believe with your faith. Luther was especially upset about statues and paintings. The cult of the saints was one of the things that he found very objectionable. So out went the statues in the churches, out went the stained glass windows. These things were looked upon as distractions to what true faith, which in faith that the Bible offers. Now, as far as worship is concerned, the Lutheran worship tended to be pretty much modeled on Catholic worship. This would not be too surprised. But there were changes, and one was the vernacular. Luther said we've got to let people know what there is going on in church, and that requires things to be in German, not in Latin. And thus there was a transition to the vernacular at the Mass, because he believed strongly in having the Luther services in a language which they can understand. As far as worship is concerned, the sermon becomes all important. And thus, in most Lutheran churches, you're going to find the pulpit given a very impressive place, because the preacher is going to need that for his sermons. The Lutherans speak of them, their minister, as pastor. So it's as a pastor that the ministers see themselves. Again, if you were a Lutheran pastor in a Catholic area and you were in danger of arrest and trial and execution, and the same was true in the opposite direction. If you were a Catholic in a Protestant area, then you were in danger of being arrested and put on trial. Again, it's hard to imagine how tough this was. After worship, one of the things of morality, and here Luther made some changes as well. One of the things that his friends kept after him was that he should get married, and he resisted this. He said, I don't know anything about marriage, and but eventually he was persuaded, and he found a lady who was once a nun, and who, in a sense, he had rescued. There were 9 nuns who had become Calvinists, or not Calvinists, Lutherans, and he saw to their freedom, one would say, so that they could worship as they wanted. And one of these was a lady named Catherine von Bora. And so he agreed finally to get married, though somewhat reluctantly. And she's a fairly nice-looking lady, and she's helped Luther. She owned property in her own name, and that was kind of rare in Germany at this time. So Luther says she was neither beautiful nor as one might expect, but I cherish her, was the way he put it. And they carried on a lively correspondence throughout their family. They had 6 children that survived, and he was they were the very model of a bourgeois German family of the 17th century. And as I said, Catherine had her own bank account, and she had her own way of looking at things, but she stuck with Luther. And there are still descendants of Luther alive today. From the 6 children, there were 3 boys and 3 girls. And they continue to, I guess, honor their great-great-grandson. Now, throughout the Reformation period in Rome, the popes are worried not so much about Luther as, well, I don't know that for sure, but they're concerned about the Turks. The Ottoman Turks have entered the Balkans. They're chewing up the Christians who lived in that part of the world. And Suleiman the Magnificent, who was the great Sultan, made plans to capture Rome. And these had been all lined up with an alliance with France, if you could imagine that. So that he got his army as far as what's modern-day Albania, and was getting ready to cross the Adriatic Sea and to capture the city of Rome. But the French pulled out. The Pope got really upset that Turks would have Christian allies. That in itself was a thing that he didn't care much for. And but so the popes were constantly having to worry, not just about Northern Europe, because indeed, as I mentioned, there was a certain limitation to how far Lutheranism went, while the Turks, with their military force, were looked upon pretty much as invincible until Luther is gone. Um,
Regensburg?
okay, yeah. So we also have the fact that there were numerous efforts at reconciliation, but all of them fail over the issue of the Eucharist. It's interesting that that would be the issue that even divided Protestants. Now, once you start a Reformation, it's hard to stop it. People get used to the revolution. But in Luther's case, 2 years after Luther nailed his theses, a man named Ulrich Zwingli in Switzerland started his own Reformation and decided that he would reform the church his way, not Luther's way. And thus Zwingli rallied people of Protestant sympathies to join his cause, and this worked to have the Lutherans join him, and of course the Lutherans wanted him and his group to follow them. And Zwingli eventually in the 1530s was killed in battle fighting the Catholic areas of Switzerland. So, but Zwingli and Luther could not agree on the Eucharist. Eucharist was, for Luther, the real presence was essential. That Jesus was in the Eucharist, the bread in the Eucharist, and you could not say, as Zwingli did, that it was a symbol of faith, that it was a effort to represent Jesus in the bread, but it wasn't, the bread did not contain Jesus himself, but rather it was a reflection of him. Now, the churches that are called today evangelical, for the most part, follow Zwingli's ideas. So that, again, it is not the real presence as far as they're concerned, but they look upon the true faith to require the Eucharist. But Luther met with them, Luther's friends, and Luther says, but it says, this is my body, and that's what it is. So he would not budge on the fact that the Eucharist contained the true body. And Lutherans today feel that way. There were other issues that Luther couldn't find in the Bible, and so he rejected. One of these was 5 of the 7 sacraments. In searching the Bible, he could not find any allusion made to confirmation, holy orders, and so forth. So he has only 2 sacraments, baptism and the Eucharist. So this is the baptism, he said, is required. That's obvious in the Bible. The Eucharist is, from his point of view and Catholic point of view, is the true body of Christ. So, but the rest go out the door. Now, some have come somewhat back in. Instead of having a pope or somebody in charge, Luther would argue that the cities could run their own churches, and the dukes, the various princes in Germany, could run their local churches as well. So that Lutheranism was very much decentralized, unlike the Pope in Rome, where a lot of authority was vested and centralized. In Lutheran practice, although some have bishops and some don't, the way that it was looked upon as the correct way was to let each congregation pretty much follow its own way with no real effort to bring them together. There were other groups that were similar to Luther. A group put together known as Anabaptists, and their big problem was that they did not believe in infant baptism, and that's still found in some of the Protestant denominations in America. That the only way to govern a church is through decentralization. Well, we thank Luther for his wisdom or what he has had to say. We think hopefully have more knowledge that we can use in an age where the vitriolic between Lutheran and Catholic has pretty well disappeared, and the churches are coming closer and closer together, and they are willing to celebrate, not celebrate, but commemorate the Reformation on Halloween night this year will be the exact date. So thank you for your attention. Well, good evening, everyone. Delighted that we have a crowd that's interested in Luther. I'd like to thank, before I answer any of your questions, my good friend Mark, and I knew this would happen. I said, I forget proper names, that's why I'm a historian. Well, what I do want to do is to answer questions that you might have from the show about Luther. I thought the fellow who was giving that talk looked very sleepy. It kind of worried me whether anybody would persevere long enough to have a session of question and answer for the rest of the evening. So hopefully you do have a few questions, and if you don't, I'll talk. Has anybody got anything to say? People hold on to sleep.
Yep, the gentleman back there, and then we'll.
Okay. Now you're going to tell my wife or Greg, because I can't hear anymore.
On the matter of indulgences,
Yeah.
was Luther basically right and the church's teachings wrong?
Okay, the question is, was Luther right and the church wrong? Let's go back to the 13th century is when indulgences began to be used. They were generally part of the crusading movement, the people who wanted to do something. But yes, the preacher who came to Germany, Johann Tetzel, did exaggerate what the doctrine of the church was. Tetzel said, that if you make a donation, you have no doubt that you get it. There's no question about if. It's a question of yes, you've gotten it. And the second thing was you can get it for the dead. The dead people can get another thing was that people could, who were interested, could also find other ways to be, saved. Basically, being saved meant donating money for the rebuilding of St. Peter's. And that was a big deal. Now, you could get an indulgence if you were too poor, but if you could afford it, then you were supposed to donate to Tetzel. He also had on the same wagon in which he preached. From there, he had a banker from the Fugger family of Augsburg, and they collected their half because they had made a loan so that the indulgence could be preached. all of this hangs around, I don't think people, or at least a lot of theologians don't realize, original sin. How do you get rid of original sin and then the lesser sins that you are personal sins? But basically, the idea of original sin was not something that was found at all in the Eastern churches. So presumably half of Christendom doesn't have a doctrine of original sin. So this causes problems when you think that has the church always taught the same thing? Well, half of the church doesn't teach it at all. And so it's a much of different things. So the indulgence was initiated in Rome to make people feel better. It's similar, I use to a suspended sentence. Let's say you're driving along and you get arrested by a policeman, and the policeman takes you to court and you're accused, and so you could be accused of sin, and then you say, but Judge, I can't afford to go to jail for 30 days. I'll go to a lecture at St. Our Lady on Carmel instead if you let me out of this. And so the judge says, okay. So what an indulgence does is not to forgive sin, only penance, the sacrament of penance forgives sin. But the indulgence takes away that portion of your penalty for having sinned on earth. So it's something that's completely terrestrial. The idea that you're going to be, this is 7 years or 30 years out of, if you get into indulgence, this is not the case. Frankly, I think that the indulgences are, I may not get hit by a lightning bolt here, but I think they've become unnecessary. I mean, we don't have that many penances. It's easy to say, you know, to the bishop, like, please give me an indulgence for 30 days when you've gotten 3 Hail Marys for your penance. So that's the whole question. So was Tetzel right? No. Was the teaching of the doctrine of the indulgence understood by people? Probably not. And so we just have to start from there. But there still is you can still get an indulgence, don't give up. I'm sure that if you send some money to St. Peter's, they'll be happy to return by mail an envelope. So if you're anything like us, we get about 20 requests for money every day.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Oh, excuse me,
Joe. Young lady in the third row.
Luther believed in justification by faith alone. So how did he reconcile that with the letter of James, where James says that faith without works is dead?
Luther said that it was faith alone, but James said faith without works is dead. So how does this get reconciled?
Oh, out of it. Yeah, well, Luther didn't try to reconcile it. When it came to looking at the verse, that faith without works is dead, which is found in the Epistle of Luke, this was obviously open against the contrast that goes the other direction. So Luther just simply said that James is an epistle of straw. We don't have to pay any attention to it. The only thing that really matters again is faith. And to prove that even more than usual, he pointed out the fact that when he translates the New Testament and gets to the Epistle of Romans, where it says the just man is justified through faith, he added alone. That's not in the original text. Okay. Next.
On the front row.
Yes. I just wanted to ask if there was
experiences that Luther had when he was in Rome visiting, which was some years before he ever put up his thesis.
Yes, so the question is, when Luther was in Rome, it was sort of the one time he ever left Germany, did he have any bad experiences? And the answer is yes. I mean, he's used to coming from a country where you say, in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. He got to Rome and the people were saying, no, in Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. It was just a different way to look at what you wanted to get across. And there's a different national characteristic between Germany and Rome. And so Luther was unhappy with what he's found in Rome. There was an abuse there, and that was the fact that a Mass was said time after time. There were simply Mass priests who did nothing else but say Mass all day. If they didn't get a stipend, they quit and went back and started over. Well, that's obviously not what the Mass is all about. And then Luther was disillusioned. He comes back very unhappy. And so I say yes, he was influenced by his experience, and unfortunately it was a bad experience. He comes to Rome where the Pope a little bit earlier had received a gift, and the gift was an elephant. The King of Portugal sent the Pope an elephant, and the Pope got a great deal of enjoyment walking around Rome with his elephant. Well, he could have been doing something better, I think, but it must have been quite a sight. Yes, Nick?
In the back?
Could you comment on, well, today we have about 40,000 different Christian faiths, at least that's the latest number, and each one believes just a little bit different, this, that, and the other. And they can obviously all trace their roots back to Martin Luther. So, I don't know, do you think that he could be considered the father of secular humanism? That is to say that you can have, that there is no truth, that you can have your truth and I can have my truth, and you can all just coexist. I said, do you see any relationship, or are you tracing this all back?
You've got to keep the question short.
Well, human secularism, there is no truth. Your truth, you have your truth and I have mine.
Human secularism. Wait a minute. Human secularism has no truth. You have your truth, I have mine, and she wants you to see how Luther. Go ahead, now say it again. I'm sorry, I just can't remember it as well.
Can you now repeat the question in short form?
Yeah.
There are about 40,000 different Christian religions, and each believes something different.
Something different.
They all have
3,999 are wrong.
They have their
She wants you to know.
There
how
is
to
no
trace
truth.
it back to
You have your
Luther saying
truth,
that there's no
I
truth.
have my truth.
Can you trace
They're
it
all
back to
traceable back to Martin Luther.
Can you?
Can you
Okay.
comment on whether you consider him the father
Could he be the father of
secular humanism?
I always say it would be a stretch to say that Luther was the father of humanism. The two were parallel one another. Humanism was being bandied from the 4th century, the 14th century, all through the Roman. Luther was enamored of the classics. He studied people like Aristotle was his model, but there's no doubt that he was influenced by others. After all, he taught and was head of the Department of Theology in Rome, excuse me. Now, as far as secular humanism is concerned, well, see, the Catholic Church does believe in truth as an absolute. We identify with the fact that God has given us a revelation, and that revelation is in concrete. Other religions are more broad in their interpretation, and there are people who have no religion at all. but simply look to humanism as their guide. So it's a complex issue as to whether or not the Reformation got a boost from the Renaissance. There's no doubt there was a rebirth of knowledge and inquiry in the ancient Greek authors that Cosimo de' Medici and people like that were very much enamored with the classical tradition.
Tom?
Over there, somebody over there.
Hi, good evening, Dr. Over here. You spoke of the translation of the Bible by Luther. Did he go back to the original languages, or did he rely on primarily the Vulgate? And is there any evidence that would suggest that he looked at the writings of the Church Fathers?
Okay, so the question is, did Luther get original sources, or did he perhaps borrow from others? Well, the answer is yes to both questions. He along with the other people who were part of the movement of the secular humanism, was enamored of the translation by Erasmus. Erasmus was a contemporary of Luther. He's the first one to use the original sources in the Latin Western world, so that Luther did have a guide in Erasmus's translation. But there were other German, I think it's important when people say, well, the church didn't let people read the Bible. Well, they didn't read the Bible because they couldn't read. It wasn't, they were hiding something. So it's a good question. I'm on the side of those people who think that the Renaissance and Reformation didn't intersect. That they're two separate movements who happen to live together at the same time in the same place. But the Reformation didn't have much success in Italy or in the Mediterranean countries where humanism did, while on the other hand, Catholicism didn't have much success in holding on to people in Northern Europe. So a lot of it is geography here too. Okay. Okay.
In the back there?
Can you maybe make a brief comment on the Catholic Counter-Reformation, some of the responses to Luther?
What about the Catholic Counter-Reformation?
Oh, the Catholic Counter-Reformation? Well, it started almost as soon as Luther did. It's trying to counter Luther's reform. By the way, the word reform was not used. It was not until about 50 years. The word reform was used for changing the curriculum in school. Okay, I said that, okay. What am I answering?
The Counter-Reformation.
Oh, the Counter-Reformation? Well, yeah, there were all kinds of efforts for reconciliation, and the big ones were Worms. When the theologian Reagan's was obviously an important one. But the issue that stopped all reconciliation was the Eucharist, which I think is interesting. But in the textbooks that your children are reading, it'll say, I haven't said this is without proof, that the reason the Reformation succeeds is that the church had been corrupt, and now it was going to be purified. Well, that wasn't the issue. Luther could have yelled bloody murder about the morals of the local bishop, who instantly became a Lutheran. But nobody would have bothered him. It was sort of the day when you didn't have anything to do. You could think about whether or not I'm lost now. I can't remember. I'm sorry, I'm getting too old to do this. Did I answer your question, or are you gonna ask it
No, you
again?
did. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, I'm sorry.
Just a couple more questions.
Okay, and then we'll close shop.
When we take this one,
Maybe there's no
I'm
more.
thinking of Gutenberg's invention, and I've heard it said that the propaganda, you alluded to it, was among the common people because they couldn't read. Did they use cartooning, sort of like characters?
Did they use cartooning to get Luther's documents out? Well, how did they send this information out?
How did they use
Did he use cartoons?
cartoon
Yeah, images instead of
images?
printing.
Drawings.
No, I don't think so, at least I don't know that they did.
Well,
Drawings.
like the cathedrals, the windows told the stories. It has
Yeah.
been said that Luther used, through the printing press, had brought the pictures so
Yeah.
that the common people could know things.
Yeah, especially woodcuts.
Yes.
They really did a
Jury
fine
orders.
job. And there was a pamphlet war. And the argument between Luther and the popes was very vitriolic. There wasn't a bit of give either way. Luther said the Pope is Antichrist, and the Pope answered back, we were double Antichrist. So it went. There was just a constant, really, it's embarrassing to read some of the, what's called table talk, which included Luther. But we would be shocked at what went on.
If the poor folks couldn't read, how did they get involved in it?
Well, how did the peasants get involved?
Was that
They were
where the
told to
images-
do. They were told to do so by their nobles,
So
by
there wasn't
their
an
lords.
image- Was there images used? Did
Oh,
they-
images were used, but frankly, people didn't care about the peasants. The people who were making policy weren't that interested. Whatever they decided, that's what the peasants should do. So you had this peasants' revolt within 4 years of Luther because the peasants said, hey, we don't pay church taxes anymore. And then somebody said, well, if we don't pay church taxes, how about not paying taxes to the Lord? But the Lord said, no, that's not what I had in mind. And so, somewhat like the IRS, they come charging down and grabbing you. So the peasants, the church continued to demand its tenth in the 16th century. Well, Greg, I think it's time to wind this up. Thank you. This is the 17th year, and I think I've almost been here from the beginning.
just about. You missed 1 year out of all 18 years.
Well, it just goes to show you how desperate he is for speaking.
No, we're very glad that you're here. We thank you for being here, even though with the technical age that we're in, that we make transitions and adapt to what we need to get the experts here with us. So we thank you, Professor Frazee, for being here. We thank you all as an audience to be here. And just as a reminder, there are flyers on the registration tables. Next Wednesday evening at the Cathedral, there's the Ecumenical Prayer Service for Christian Unity, and it's being hosted by Bishop Van and Bishop Andrew Taylor, who's the Bishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. You're all invited. It's at 7:30 in the Arboretum at the Cathedral, and the reception follows afterwards. But for those of you who are here this evening, we thank you for being here. There's some refreshments left if you would like to stay around for some fellowship. We appreciate it. And remind you that our next talk will be on November 9th, and which you're always invited, and you're welcome to invite friends along with you. Thank you all for being here.
Mark, you gotta wake up.
I went to St. Meinrad
for 2 years. Yeah, that's what I heard. Yeah, I was there for 2 years.
I went for 8.
8 years.
Not yet.
Were you in the minor and then you went to
I've
center?
got to check
I went
because
when
I
I
know
was
there's a bit of a
13 years.
conflict.
Wow. Did you know the monks down at Oceanside?
Father Felix, yeah.
Oh,
Father
he's amazing.
Rudolph,
Yeah,
Father
yeah, yeah.
Claude.
But he'll be here
Father
either
Bernard.
November or December. I've got it.
Okay. All right.
All
But if
gone.
you're on the email list, you'll get
Yes,
the
I am. Yeah, so I haven't.
Yeah, I think all
so
the
you
old
should be,
ones are
when you
gone.
send this one,
Yeah,
there's
nice meeting
information
you.
about the next
Right.
one as well. So, but
Yeah.
I hope it's Father Felix is amazing.
Okay, good, thank you.
How many years have you been doing?
This is the 18th, and I think this is the 216th lecture.
I want to congratulate you
Thanks.
because I've been like an annual visitor. I brought my friend Paul.
Very nice to.
I'm a heretic.
There are no heretics. There's friends who have disagreements.
But we're colleagues. And